So today I wanted to start off my talk with a definition of something we don't really talk that much about, which is kind of awkward considering the fact that we all live in one. So I hit up a close personal friend of mine, maybe you guys know him, his name's Google, and I got the definition of a nation. And when I read this, a couple things popped out to me, and that was mainly the fact that it's defined by the fact that you have a common language or a common descent. And maybe it's just my millennial eyes, but it doesn't seem that consistent with how we view the world now. In a world where you can talk to anyone whenever you want, go anywhere whenever you want, eat their food, watch their movies, read their books, it almost seems silly to try to separate people based on these demarcations in language and descent. And really, in many ways, I would argue that globalization has kind of made the nation-state an antiquated idea. And that's really not just something I came up with. You see it a lot in pop culture. Whenever there's an alien invasion threatening the Earth in the future, it's always the world government responds. It's never the United States responds, the UK responds. There's always this kind of assumption that we'd always progress towards a world where we'd all unite under one banner as humans and kind of cast aside a lot of the things that kept us apart, like language, like descent, like ethnicity, and so on and so forth. But the kind of cool thing is that it hasn't been limited to pop culture recently. In the post-World War II era, there's been a lot of examples of us kind of uniting as regions, maybe not a world yet, with things like the EU or the UN or NATO, Arab League, so on and so forth. We're trying to act in the interests of a large group of people instead of the people that just live in your little lines on the map. But this is all just kind of cool to talk about, but it really didn't mean anything without data. And luckily, there's been a lot more data recently. So the KOF is an organization out of Switzerland, like it seems like every organization is out of Switzerland for some reason, but they live there. And just from my lifetime, so the top map is 1992. Yeah, I apologize for making people feel old, but that's when I was born. And the bottom map is the most recent data, so 2012 that they compiled. And it's pretty clear that there's been an increase in what they call the globalization index, pretty uniformly. And what is the globalization index? It's defined by three things: social, political, and economic. So an example of a political factor would be the willingness to provide visas to people, or tourism and ability to move in and out of the country. Economic would be things like participation in international trade, lack of tariffs, so on and so forth. And a social thing would be something even as innocuous as having a McDonald's in your country or having an internet cafe in your country. And there's been an increase in globalization, like I said, but again, wake me when I tell you something new, right? We can just look out the window and really tell that this world is a lot smaller than when we started off, only 23 years ago. I forgot how old I was. So what's cool is that there was actually a study done where it looked at the fact that earlier I said that globalization's kind of made the nation antiquated, and people put in actual time into investigating this question. So there was a survey done in 63 countries, and it's a pretty big survey. At least 50,000 people responded in each country. And it was a series of questions to identify the three things the researchers defined as a nation state. All nations, if you have a real nation, should feel these three things: as patriotism, a sense of ethnic identity, and the willingness to die for your country. So they asked the survey respondents those three questions. Mainly on patriotism, they asked them, do you think your country is better than every other country in the world? On ethnic identity, they asked them, to be truly blank, you must be ethnically blank. To be truly French, you must be ethnically French. And the third thing is, would you be willing to die for your country if it came to that purpose? And I hate stats as much as the next guy, but the statistical significance was amazing for the fact that as globalization index was higher in a country, the respondents in those countries were more likely to answer no to all three of those questions. So again, it's consistent with what we've been talking about. The more globalized you get, the less likely you are to really buy into the idea of a nation state as the thing that defines you before the fact that you're a human, or whatever it may be. But if this were the case, wouldn't we expect to see a world really harmonious, where we kind of moved past conflict and started to embrace each other as humans, like I've been saying? Well, frankly, that just hasn't been the case in current events. I mean, you see things like the rise of anti-migrant tensions, pseudo-fascism in Europe again. I mean, you have our poster boy here for the rise of xenophobic politics in America, things we haven't seen since the early 20th century. You have things the Kremlin recently said that they view the world as another Cold War with the West. I thought we won the Cold War already. And again, you have things like the civil war, Islamic fundamentalism in the Middle East. So why do we see such conflict in a world where all the data is telling us that we're becoming more unified and not splitting apart by ethnic identity, or we're not willing to even die for our countries? And there's been a lot of research into this field, and it hasn't been as satisfactory as one would hope. And the reason I put forth is that if you keep looking at a problem from the same perspective over and over again, i.e., if you keep looking at this problem through a political science lens, you're going to tend to get the same results over and over and over again. And I think there's inherent value in looking at something from a unique perspective that you may not even thought to be related to the initial problem, to try to get maybe some new insight and maybe some new answers on there. So I suggest that it would be an interesting thing to look at the world through a medical lens. And that's not just because I'm a medical student, but it is awful convenient. But really what I'm looking to do is think of the world as a patient. So if the world came into my clinic, or if I had a clinic in 2 years, and hundreds of tests, hundreds of thousands of dollars before I can even have a clinic, but once I get that clinic, if a world came into my clinic, how would I diagnose that person? So in medical jargon, we use a thing called chief complaint. It's basically, doc, my leg hurts, I got a sore throat, whatever you usually go into your doctor's office with. And then we have a history where you point to the fact that my throat hurts because my son came home from school and everybody's sick at school, so I think I caught it from him. And for us, the world would come in saying, hey, doc, the globalization isn't going like I thought it would be. I thought it would be a lot more peaceful than this. Why is there so much unrest? And they point to a lot of the things we talked about. And putting on my doctor's cap, well, I guess my student doctor's cap right now, but putting that on, I would diagnose the world with an identity crisis. So what exactly is an identity crisis? It's basically, we see it most commonly in adolescence, so in a way I am saying the world is going through puberty. And it was a rough time for all of us. I mean, my mom's in the audience. She used to cut my hair, and I thought that was a good idea. Love you, Mom. Either way, so it's going through an identity crisis. So what does that mean? It's when your environment changes so frequently that what you once knew in the past is no longer consistent with what you see in the world around you. It sounds awful familiar to what we're talking about with the world. Globalization is changing the world so rapidly, so dynamically, in ways we don't even fully comprehend yet, that it's not consistent with how we thought of the world for hundreds of years, mainly as a group of nation states separated by things like ethnicity, religion, language, so on and so forth. So the next question the patient always asks is, so what's the prognosis? Or what does that mean for me? So there's really two ways to think about this. And to really understand what I'm talking about with how the world would cope with it, you got to think about how a patient would cope with an identity crisis. So the most common coping mechanism you see in psychology is a thing called anchoring. It's called regression sometimes. It's basically, I don't understand what's going on in this world right now, so I'm going to go back to when things made sense to me. I think this made a lot of sense to a lot of people for hundreds of years. So what I'm putting forth is the fact that the world is in essence coping with the unintended, ununderstood ramifications of globalization as it best knows how to, because ultimately the world is just a group of individuals, and we can't fight the things that make us human, like coping with things we don't understand. So what am I telling you? Are we doomed to live in a world under President Trump and Putin owns half of Europe and civil war is everyday thing? Well, I said anchoring or regression is the most common coping mechanism you see. It is not the only coping mechanism you see. Another one that I would put forth is it's called sublimation. So what does that mean? I don't understand what's going on, but instead of channeling that into a negative outlet, I'm going to channel it into a positive outlet. So what are some examples of this? To give a few examples, a negative output. So let's say a lot of you might be in the audience. These decisions are made above my head. What can I do as just a college student or whatever it may be to try to influence this? I should just throw my hands up in the air and just accept the fact that this is going to happen. A positive approach would be to understand that you are, at least in America, and as imperfect as the system may be, you do have a unique voice. And you can do things like vote, which is hilarious because you think young people are always the most politically engaged people, feel the burn, all that stuff. But voter turnout among young people is abysmal in this country. So you could do such, just channeling some of your confusion into that would be one example. Another example, say a family from a country moves into your neighborhood. You don't really understand their culture, so you kind of just leave them to themselves. You don't want to impose or anything like that. A positive approach to that would be to engage those people, to get to know those people and learn what they're all about, Because really, the best way to understand that we all are human, that we all live in one world, is to understand that there's not that much that holds us separate. I mean, we all like good food, we all like music, we all love our families, we're all human. So what I put forth is that first, if we understand that the world is having an identity crisis, and then we fight our very human urges to anchor and go back to what I had earlier with Trump, and go towards this more positive outlook of voting, of engaging people, you can really shift the prognosis for the world. And you can make sure that this ugly blip all across the world going on right now is just that, a blip, and not the trend of what we can see forward. So really, all I can say, my big message worth sharing, I guess, this is a TED Talk, right, is engage people, learn about people, try to channel some of the confusion that we all feel as humans into a positive outlook, because I think that will put us back on track towards this ideal view of the future where everyone lives under a common banner. And really, that's the kind of world I want to live in, and I hope that's the kind of world that all of you guys want to live in. Thanks.